Oh, ShadPS4, it's been almost a year since I've covered this emulator on my channel, and as fond as I am of that video and that period of my channel in particular, in all honesty, that video is garbage. I mean, the editing is just a mess and my microphone can only be heard on the left ear, which makes watching it just give me a headache. For this reason, I decided to make a new updated video where I'll go over the biggest improvements this emulator has received over the last year, and I'll go over the current state of the emulator in general. Now, again, it is very much worth mentioning that everything I say in this video is only accurate as of the making of the video. ShadPS4 is in rapid development, and everything I say can and probably will change in the future. To get the best and most up-to-date information regarding the emulator, the best place to check is their Discord server, which I will link in the description of the video. Also, compatibility for games varies a lot, between different builds and hardware especially. In my experience, a game may not want to boot at all for me, but will work perfectly fine on someone else's PC, despite using the same settings. So keep that in mind as well. Also, for those of you who enjoy watching emulation related content like this, I just want to say that I plan to make a series where I cover all major emulators just like this one, so if you wish to watch that, you could, subscribe to my channel. Now, before talking about any specific games, I'll quickly go over the installation process of the emulator again, as it has changed a bit since I've last covered it. Firstly, you'll want to head over to the Add Infested ShadPS4 website, head over to the Downloads tab and download the latest Qt launcher of the emulator. Extract it anywhere you want and open it. In the top right corner of the screen, click on Version Manager, and here you'll be able to download any build of ShadPS4. For the best results, you'll want to download the pre-release nightly build, as it's called, and as this is the newest version of the emulator that gets constantly updated. There is an option to automatically check for pre-release updates, but I don't recommend enabling this, and here's why. ShadPS4 gets updated almost every single day, and as is the case with every emulator, something usually can and will break every once in a while. And the best rule of thumb when emulating games is that if you've got everything to work properly and you're happy with how your game is running, just don't mess around with anything. Otherwise you just risk breaking something. Another thing I have to talk about is the ever so convoluted process of actually obtaining games. First of all, I still cannot show you how to pirate games and obtain them in any form of a legal way. Again, this is not due to me being a shill for big corporations and whatnot. In fact, I'm very much on the other side of the fence here. But it's just that doing so would risk this video and my channel getting taken down, and the developers of the emulator are also very much against piracy, since they also probably fear getting struck down by Sony, which, again, isn't too unrealistic of a thing to expect. I still remember RPCS3 being in hot water years ago when Persona 5 started running on it, and considering ShadPS4 is popular for running one game that notoriously will never get a PC port, I think being cautious is a good thing. So, to get games, you will need a jailbroken PlayStation 4, and I will link Modded Warfare's guide on dumping games in the description of the video. However, one thing I can't for the love of me understand is the decision to take out the ability to install .pkg files on the emulator. The ShadPS4 devs' argument is that .pkg files were only really used to install pirated games, and while that is somewhat correct, .pkg is also the format in which game updates come in, and most people just download these from the internet. So, installing them has become more complicated in the process. The way I personally get around this is by using this tool from Azahar Plus, which allows me to extract any PKG file just by dragging and dropping it onto the .exe, and that's it. Okay, so we're done with the boring stuff. Let's talk about games. Now, I'm guessing that a lot of you are just mainly interested in Bloodborne, and I will talk about it, but I want to talk about some other games first, so if you only want to see Bloodborne, skip to this timestamp in the video. The first game I wish to talk about is Drive Club. In my last video, I unfortunately couldn't get the game to boot for whatever reason, but thankfully I managed to get it to run this time around, and boy is it pretty. Now, in order to actually get Drive Club to run on ShadPS4, you will need to update it to version 1.28, as 1.0 will just hang on a black screen. You will also need the system modules, which you will, again, need to dump from your PlayStation 4, link for the guys in the description. And once you have these, go to App Data, Roaming, ShadPS4, Sys Modules, and place the file here. Now, you'll be able to run Drive Club, and when I first started playing it, it looked great, but then this just happened. So, the game just decided to fade away to black, and I was stuck driving like this until the end of the race. After getting into the menus, I decided to try out another race, and it turns out that the game was just darker for some reason, and I would only get a small glimpse of proper lighting when rotating the camera or switching between different camera modes. I decided to snoop around, and it turns out that this issue can be fixed by going into ShadPS4 settings and in the experimental tab setting the readbacks mode to precise. Another thing I recommend enabling for every game is shader caching, which allows the emulator to build and store shaders on your PC instead of building them anew every time you launch the game. This makes stuttering much less frequent and is a really good thing to have. With the new settings applied, I booted up Drive Club and now it finally looked and ran as it should. But we can go further. By right-clicking on Drive Club and opening cheats and patches, we can download the latest patches for the game, and there's some interesting stuff here. Firstly, we have the 60 FPS patch. I recommend using the Delta Time one, as the fixed tick rate one just caused the game to slow down for me. But you can experiment and see what works best. Now with my PC and readbacks enabled, I cannot get 60 FPS in Drive Club. However, I'm sure that with a stronger system, the game will run better. Another cool thing we can do with Drive Club is plain ultrawide. So if you have a 21:9 or 32:9 monitor, you can use all of its real estate to play, and this looks really good. Overall, Drive Club on ShadPS4 runs well, however it still needs some work in order to be what I'd consider fully playable. The next game I wish to talk about is UFC, so for some reason, the only sports game I actually care about never got ported to PC. And thankfully, that's about to change now. Now, keep in mind that I only tried playing UFC 4 on the emulator, however I think that all other UFC games can also boot, but I'm not entirely sure how playable they are. So to get UFC 4 up and running, you will obviously need the game, but you'll also need a custom build of ShadPS4 from a user named DiegoLix29. This build has some necessary settings and fixes to get the UFC running properly on the emulator, and we will also use it later on for Bloodborne. In the settings, go to the experimental tab, enable linear image readbacks and set the readback speed to default. In the debug tab, enable these settings as shown on screen and close it. Now, a guide I was following for UFC 4 mentioned that I should also install the Vulkan SDK before running the game. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this actually impacts anything, and I have a feeling it does not, but keep it in mind if you run into problems. Okay, so how does the game run? Well, it's not perfect. First of all, the performance will obviously not be perfect since we're forced to use readbacks, and there is no 60 FPS patch for the game. The next major problem are the character models. In my experience, every time I play a match, the opponent's right arm will be completely black for some reason. Now, I personally didn't mind this too much and I didn't find it that distracting, but it's still an issue worth mentioning. However, the issues get more severe if you decide to start a career. When playing career mode, basically all the character models will have some form of color issue, and the problems vary from match to match and it's always pretty random. Sometimes you'll be completely black, sometimes you'll be rainbow puke, and there's no real rule, and playing like this is pretty distracting and not a great experience. Also, for some reason, I would get these huge frame rate drops in the first few fights depending on where I was looking. Would I call UFC 4 playable on ShadPS4? Well, no, it's still far from perfect, and as impressive as this is, it's a far cry from a great experience. The next game I briefly want to cover is Crash Team Racing. Now, for some reason, this game never came to PC, and as it turns out, it's fully playable on ShadPS4 without requiring any tweaking. The game runs perfectly fine with the default settings, however, there's one thing we can change. The game is locked to 30 FPS, and by increasing the V-blank frequency to whatever our monitor's refresh rate is, we can unlock the frame rate and make the game play gorgeously. Now, Crash Team Racing was already playable on PC thanks to Nintendo Switch emulation, but I think this is a nice novelty to have. Okay, so we're finally going to talk about the game most people are interested in, Bloodborne. Now, as you may expect, this game in particular has had the biggest interest in the community, which is why so many mods, patches and fixes have been made for it. And I have to say, we are officially at a point where I can certainly say that Bloodborne is fully playable on PC. Now, the only mod we still use to play Bloodborne properly is the Vertex Explosion fix, which you can just paste in your game's directory and you're done. For the build, I am using Diego Lix's branch of ShadPS4, as in my experience it runs a bit better, however I have heard that the main branch is just as stable nowadays anyways. As for the settings, there's really only one you need to change, and that's the memory allocation in the experimental tab, which I just increased to 2000 as this allows us to increase the game's resolution without causing problems. Now, upscaling the resolution used to cause a massive hit to the performance, but luckily for us this has been very much improved, and now even on my 3060 Ti, I can almost get a locked 60 FPS at 1440p. And yes, another cool thing you can do is run Bloodborne in ultra wide, which with the proper setup looks sick. There are a ton of patches you can enable and it's worth messing around with them. Overall, I think this is the closest we'll get to any form of Bloodborne remaster, considering Sony won't ever give us that. And if you're a fan of the game, I highly recommend trying it out on ShadPS4. Well, we've almost reached the end of the video, and before ending it, I'd like to mention a couple of other random games I've tried. Dying Light is an odd example of a game that runs almost perfectly on ShadPS4. Now, I am obviously well aware that this game has a PC port, but I don't know why, I find it really fascinating that a AAA game that's still very advanced from a technical standpoint is running this well on an emulator. As for games I couldn't get to run, well, I have two. Neck is a game that should apparently be playable on ShadPS4, but I could never get it to go past the initial loading screen. Ratchet & Clank is a game that I could get to launch once, and it looked like this. And upon restarting it, it just didn't want to go in game, and I couldn't figure out the cause. So yeah, there is still definitely work that needs to be done, and the results can vary vastly. Okay, so that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and possibly learned something interesting. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.